right above you. So you're going to write down questions. Repulse those questions. Linguists. And then neutralize. I kind of like the light on.
Yes.
Green is fine. Yeah. We can see you.
Yep.
I love to see Jared on these edgy black backgrounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, like forget my password. Hi everyone. Hi. My name is Jared. Some of you were at my defense last week, so some of this will sound very familiar. In your programs, the title's different because it got switched towards the end because we realized it was doing more. My thesis was doing more than the previous title actually suggested. So the title now is Nostalgic Notions and Digital Desires: the implications of the digital-physical divide. So I'm going to kind of read off of this a little bit because even at this point, these ideas are still kind of hard to talk about. I can't just do it off the top of my head. So anyway, I'm going to kind of first describe the nature of my research and field of study as well as how these ideas emerged. And I'll illustrate how I began to see them to fit together in important ways and in ways that made me really excited to do research. There are many different threads in this thesis, interweaving and overlapping in ways that I'll articulate as best I can. So I'm an English graduate student with an emphasis in rhetoric and composition, and I teach academic writing here at Chico State. My research and study is based in composition, literacy studies, and digital rhetoric, and reading widely in these areas has led me to the sociocultural theory of digital dualism, and how this pervading cultural framework results in perspectives that work to distort and alter values around the emergence and mainstreamification of digital tools in our culture. So this distortion manifests as a conceptual separation between the digital and the non-digital narratives in our lives, leading to a sense that the modern identity is fragmented by the usage and effects of the very tools we create. Anti-digital dualism, or augmented reality, posits that this is and always has been a fallacy, and that in fact, quote, the digital and the physical are increasingly meshed. So emerging from this perceived conflict between the value of digital versus physical experience lies the notion that there has always been a deep cultural appreciation for tradition, or for processes and practices which are already known. And this appreciation fosters cycles of conflict between our trust with the old and our embrace of the new. So it all started with the University of Maryland graduate student named Nathan Jurgensen, who contributes to this blog called Cyborgology, that he co-created and now co-edits. So the article was called Digital Dualism versus Augmented Reality, and in this piece he called my attention for the first time to the idea of digital dualism, where he asserts that there remains a sociocultural desire to think of the digital world as virtual and the physical world as real. And more simply, it's a theory that there remains a distinct and recognizable separation between online and offline experience. So in this piece, Jurgensen pushes against this notion and claims that this division has in fact dissolved, where experience is augmented by both the digital and the physical experience simultaneously. And where both experiences condense into one central reality. So what I got from this notion was that it was touching on the nature of identity in the 21st century. That due to the extended use of digital tools, the logic of all things digital infuse our reality and alter the way we perceive the world. Our identities, minds, perceptions, and everyday experience is mediated heavily by the digital tools that flood our lives, and the logic of all things digital lives on within us even after we close our laptops and turn off our phones. So these ideas about digital dualism also made me curious about the nature of dualities in general. What were they, and can they be noticed? So that's when I came across an article by psychoanalyst Joseph Burgo, where he was addressing why we believe in a two-party system to represent our government. He said that we often employ a psychological process known as splitting, where we choose to establish either or, black and white, and often opposing choices for ourselves. And he said that we do this as a psychological defense mechanism to resolve emotional ambivalence. So in other words, we alleviate the burden of overwhelming amounts of choice by setting up dualistic frameworks, this or that. And I don't believe we do this out of necessity. I don't think that it's the most wise way for us to structure choice for ourselves and make decisions. What are we neglecting or leaving out by doing this? So in my thesis, I argue that these types of limiting frameworks work to obscure, devalue, and limit the scope of new ideas. And I've had a problem with this from the very beginning. So from here, I began to research other cultural dualities that resembled or in some way paralleled the digital-physical duality that Jurgensen described. I was drawn most towards pervasive dualities that complicate aspects of culture, and as I examined in this project, how they complicate and problematize structures in education. So dualities like tradition and innovation, nostalgia and progress, nature and industry, theory and practice, online and offline, the virtual and the real, all became very important conceptual pieces to the research I've been doing. Thinking about these and other dualities made me start to wonder if augmented reality is a framework in which to reconcile this digital-physical divide. Perhaps there are similar ways we can deconstruct or dissolve other cultural dualities that disrupt or limit the potential of what could be. I've always been interested in and equally frustrated by the types of recurring rhetoric about the threats of new technology and the related social fears. In Ann Blair's article on the cycles of rhetoric around information overload helped to support my interest in delegitimizing recurring concerns like the threat of too much information, crises in the literate ability of our youth, the detrimental effects of new technology on society, and the continuous problem of new pedagogies and literacies clashing with traditional, deeply rooted values of the education system. Information overload is the idea that new information technology will produce more information than ever thought possible. And surely, there will be no way to traverse and make sense of it all. But Blair argues that the same rhetoric around the threat of information overload has happened time and time again throughout history, and that it is unwise of us to recreate and revive these fears with every innovation in information technology. And I think that as a culture, we do this a lot. We revive the same concerns and skeptical attitudes as new technologies provide new contexts for these social fears to thrive. So as you can see here, as I posted this week, there's this it's a comic about the short history of the death of culture. These same types of rhetoric happening over and over again. So like we're hearing right now, the internet is killing culture, nobody can write anymore. Television is killing culture, nobody talks to anyone anymore. The telegraph is killing culture, nobody can use complete sentences anymore. The printing press is killing culture, nobody can think anymore. Literacy is killing culture, nobody can remember anything. And lastly, large cranium is killing culture. Nobody amused by airborne feces. So here, fears about various forms of technology will create culture, the same type of rhetoric happening over and over again. So I really believe that the main reason these fears about new technology arise over and over again is because of our inability to let go of what we believed in, cherished, and knew to be true. In my thesis, I address the power of nostalgia as a force that distorts our perceptions of the past, but also as a means to corrupt potentials for the future. And I argue that if we dissect these recurring problems of culture, like the ones I've mentioned, at the heart of these problems we'll find the tradition-innovation duality, hard at work, creating tension and conflict between what we value about our past and what makes us excited for the future. So as a culture, we are perpetually caught between the pull of tradition and the promise of innovation. The central question that this all led me to is, can we find a way to reconcile these powerful dualistic cultural forces? I thought about the implications of dualistic thought on two different levels. The first and more far-reaching are the conceptual implications. We limit ourselves. We become blind to the multitude of choice that we have and make hasty, ill-informed decisions as a result of this limiting framework. The second, and more related to my field, are the pedagogical implications. And throughout this process, I kept asking myself, what does this research offer? And I believe we can start breaking down the limitations of dualistic thought and the education sphere by being aware. By being aware of the pervasive and often damaging dualities like tradition and innovation, nostalgia, progress, traditional and experimental methods for composing, old and new literacies, the digital and the physical, the online and offline, and how these dualities embed themselves within the psyches of teachers, both new and seasoned, altering perspectives about pedagogy and what learning should look like in school. So if we can start paying attention to and becoming aware of the underlying reasons why we value and hold dear certain teaching practices while dismissing others, we can understand that many of these decisions to reinforce these practices are strongly influenced by personal desires and ideals that are distorted by the glorification of the past. So a minute ago I asked the question, can we find a way to reconcile these powerful dualistic cultural forces that lurk in our decision-making processes? And after sitting on this question for quite some time, and enough time that it started to haunt me, 3 key concepts emerged from my research: Jurgensen's theory of augmented reality, transliteracy, and residuals. All of these concepts have very similar underlying principles that push against the constrictive nature of dualities. These frameworks resist being pulled and separated into 2 parts, and the inherent ideologies of these concepts are inclusive and transcend the boundaries of dualistic thought. So as I say in chapter 2 of my thesis, the concept of transliteracy mirrors Jurgensen's argument about augmented reality and that they share the same theoretical foundation. Both concepts' internal arguments are about blending and layering with the purpose of dissolving constrictive frames. So in thinking about how this inclusive framework plays out in pedagogy and literacy, transliteracy places all methods and tools within a common and equally relevant pedagogical system of practice, or as Sue Thomas would call it, a unified ecology of media. So in this framework, digital and non-digital methods exist and interact harmoniously. Traditional experimental practices are not at odds with one another. They can be blended and used in various combinations and are chosen based on which tool or method is most appropriate given the context for its use. The transliterate framework breaks down the tradition, innovation, and duality by making them work in service of each other. So toward the end of my thesis, I focus on 3 different classifications of residuals: cultural, literacy, and technological. And I examine the influence of residuals on emergent aspects of culture, emergent literacies, and emergent technologies. We live in a culture where technology and the means by which we access and attain information evolves and transforms at an extremely high rate, quite possibly at a rate which we have never experienced before. This is cultural critic Raymond Williams' model of the cultural process. So I came across this as I was reading about residuals and how residuals shape and determine what we experience in the present moment. Sorry, it's kind of like really fuzzy. So as I studied this model, I began to wonder, perhaps this exceptionally high rate of innovation causes the residual and the emergent, which usually maintain a substantial linear distance, to become interactive, where residuals become closer to the emergent than ever before. And these typically disparate processes find themselves existing and becoming more compressed within the same temporal moment. Perhaps this interaction between the residual and the emergent within the present moment results in anxiety, a cultural anxiety about which tools we should use and trust at a given technological moment, and which ones we must leave behind entirely. This anxiety has the potential to strengthen, to the point where it works to drive various cultural conflicts and divisions, much like what we are noticing with the causes and effects of digital dualism, and where the fragmented perspectives on how to use, if at all, digital tools and platforms to encourage and sustain literacy development. So from this study of residuals, I began to recognize that even after certain tools become irrelevant and their usage dies off, their memory and associated logic lives on, often in the form of metaphor, informing the way that we think about and adapt to emerging technologies. Because technology evolves exponentially, we find ourselves abandoning tools more quickly than before. We're starting to notice residuals of tools from our past re-emerging as metaphor and becoming a tool in itself. So I consider this metaphor a tool because it works to link our understanding of older tools with our exploration of new tools. Tech companies and innovators look to use the skeuomorph, or as I'll call it, a metaphor of the past, to make their software aesthetic and the overall nature of the tool look and feel more like something we have experienced in the past. Put simply, the skeuomorph is an element of design that is borrowed or transplanted from something old and utilized in something new. As you can see, these are some of the examples of new technology using aesthetics of old things: calculator, pool table, the game center, compass. So I found this all very interesting and important for my research because the skeuomorph appears to be the result of the cultural residual and the emergent beginning to overlap and interact within the same temporal frame of the cultural process. So if this is true, the skeuomorph becomes a mechanism for cultural reconciliation, where we find ourselves experiencing both the residual and emergent all at once. Consumers are certainly enticed by any new technology, we know this to be true, but at the same time, they still want to feel a sense of familiarity, a way to recollect a potentially simpler time, and a means by which to materialize nostalgic longings for what is now gone. We can see that in the study of residuals, there lie some principles that are similar to the transliterate methodology. Residuals are elements of the past that mediate and shape emerging aspects of culture, emerging literacies, emerging technologies. As Williams tells us, cultural residuals play a key role in shaping the nature of the present moment. So in a sense, traditional forms, or residuals, layer and blend together with emerging forms, innovation, and work together and coexist in non-opposing ways. So the concepts of augmented reality, translated in residuals, give me reason to believe that disruptive dualities like tradition and innovation can be broken down and overcome, and that outcomes of moving beyond the conflicted nature of dualities are well worth pursuing. Frameworks like this can help us to transcend our biases and make purpose-driven decisions that aren't swayed or determined by our distorted sense of the past. These three frameworks are about inclusion and agency and access to knowledge, which are all values that I firmly believe in. Thank you.